have heard from a number of leaders across the world who have told us that they have relaxed the quarantine measures for Santa to enter the airspace. So he will be able to travel in and out of the airspace.
There's no requirement that the manufacturers prove safety, that the products that they're selling are actually safe. They don't have, unlike drugs and, even over-the-counter products, manufacturers don't have to prove safety when they're creating these different skin creams or whatever it is that we're using.
Here's the thing. We're going to get some snow, but you never know with New York. It always plays games with us,
It is NBC LX time. It's Wednesday, December 16th. I'm Tabitha Lipkin.
And I'm JoBeth DeVera. That's right, halfway through the week. And today is the third day of COVID-19 vaccinations being administered all across the U.S., more specifically the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine. And then by the end of the week, Moderna's vaccine could get emergency use authorization by the FDA as well.
Approval of that vaccine would allow nearly 6 million doses to be shipped out by next week. That's nearly double the amount of doses of Pfizer's vaccine rolled out this week. Now, according to documents released yesterday by the FDA's Committee on Vaccines, Moderna's vaccine is 94% effective at preventing symptomatic illness and appears to prevent the spread of the virus. This level of effectiveness was noted after 2 doses were given 28 days apart.
But there's also evidence suggesting that just 1 dose of the Moderna vaccine may stop the virus's spread. A second document on the FDA website shows asymptomatic infection was reduced by 63% after the first shot. However, experts are still cautious about this data. Now, the process for approving Moderna's vaccine is going to look a lot like what we saw happen with Pfizer's vaccine. The data released yesterday is just the first step in a public review process. So here's what happens next. Tomorrow, the FDA is holding an all-day meeting with an independent advisory panel. The panel will hear from Moderna, FDA scientists, and the public before they vote on whether or not to recommend authorization of its vaccine. And while the panel is expected to greenlight the recommendation, the FDA doesn't necessarily have to follow their advice, but in most cases, they do. Now, if Moderna receives that emergency use authorization, the first injections of the vaccine could start on Monday. The company expects to produce 20 million doses by the end of this year and up to 1 billion doses in 2021.
So let's take a closer look at Moderna's vaccine. The Boston-based company partnered with the National Institutes of Health to develop and test the vaccine. It uses messenger RNA or mRNA to carry a piece of the virus's genetic material. This tells your cells to build a signature spike protein on the surface of the coronavirus, which teaches your body's immune system to respond and produce antibodies, ultimately allowing your body to fight the virus off.
Now, the way the Moderna vaccine works very similar to the Pfizer vaccine, but there is one major difference. Moderna's vaccine requires less extreme cold storage. It requires minus 20 degrees Celsius for storage compared to minus 70 for Pfizer's vaccine. And yes, really, really cold temps, but just how cold is it? To put it into perspective here, Pfizer's vaccine, it needs to be kept in temperatures colder than winter in Antarctica, according to NPR, while Moderna's vaccine just needs to be kept at temperatures that are closer to your freezer at home. This makes it easier to ship, store, and handle, which could ultimately benefit rural hospitals who don't have ultra-cold storage capabilities.
Hopefully on Friday, the expectation is that the vaccine would be approved. Its efficacy, its safety, its performance is broadly similar, if not almost identical to that of the Pfizer vaccine. Its cold chain requirements are actually less stringent in that it requires a cold that's that of a freezer, that like the freezers we have at home. And those vaccine doses will start to be shipped as of 24 hours after the approval. Hopefully they will be arriving next Monday.
And while we wait on widespread vaccination, testing for the virus, well, it just got a lot easier. The FDA approved the first COVID-19 test that can be bought at a drugstore without a prescription and then be taken at home. The Australian company Ellume developed the test that doesn't require lab samples. Instead, it works a lot like a pregnancy test, only instead of detecting a pregnancy or their hormones, it detects antigens, aka fragments of viral proteins that trigger an immune response. You can get results at an app on your phone in as little as 20 minutes. It'll cost right around $30, and you can start buying these tests in January.
Interesting. All righty, making progress there. It has been about 10 months or so since the pandemic grappled the world, but specifically here in the U.S., it's affected every aspect of our lives. So in this segment that we call The Ripple, there is one area that some advocates are focusing on, Tabs.
Yeah, and that is what happens to child development when pretty much everything that they've relied upon gets interrupted. It's going to take a lot more than a vaccine to make up everything that kids in this country are dealing with.
Yeah, NBC News has been collecting data on child welfare metrics to see what has changed since March, when schools across the country shut down. And experts are worried that this year could have lasting impacts post-pandemic, even after kids go back to in-class learning. And children facing racial and economic inequities are at a higher risk. When schools closed, food banks were inundated with hungry families. We saw food prices also increase as the pandemic interrupted supply chains. It's estimated that nearly 17 million kids, many of whom were cut off from school lunches, are in danger of not having enough to eat. And research shows a lack of access to nutritional foods can have long-term consequences on child development.
Kids are also having to deal with less social support, and it's impacting their mental health. Now, this year, emergency rooms, they've seen a 24% increase in mental health related visits for kids 5 to 11 years old. That's compared to last year. And for older kids, the increase is even higher at 31%. Experts say trauma is compounded, so dealing with possible deaths from the coronavirus is one thing, being isolated and interacting from friends. And on top of all those things, they're struggling with money and hunger. That's all building up, causing huge spikes in rates of anxiety and depression in children.
Yeah, and remote learning is also increasing gaps in education. About 3 million students are vulnerable who were already facing issues like homelessness, foster care, disabilities, or learning English as a second language. They're all at a higher risk of lifelong impacts. Experts estimate that those nearly 3 million students likely have had zero education since March. Check out how it breaks down here, according to NBC News data. About 1.3 million students with disabilities are impacted, 1.2 million for students learning English as a second language, 375,000 homeless students, 109,000 students in foster care, and 76,000 migrant students. Experts say this could have devastating impacts on their ability to keep up in school, and it increases risk for things like dropping out or failing out of school. But even those students who are still in class this year, they are facing hardships too. So let's head into our virtual world here at NBCLX to take a closer look at the impacts of remote learning.
Access granted. You are now entering the NBCLX virtual world.
Okay, so it is no secret school and education looked a lot different this year as students, teachers, and parents adjusted to virtual at-home learning. It's almost the end of 2020, and some of the impacts of remote learning are starting to come to light. The nonprofit NWEA collected data from more than 4 million students in the U.S. between 3rd grade and 8th grade who took the MAP growth assessments this past fall and asked 3 important questions. First, how did students perform in fall 2020 relative to a typical school year, specifically fall 2019? Has student growth changed since schools physically closed in March? And how did observed fall 2020 achievement compare to NWEA's projected scenarios? Well, the results show in almost all grades, most students made some learning progress in both reading and math since the pandemic started. But specifically in math, Students performed about 5 to 10 percentile points lower in that subject this fall compared to fall of 2019. Now, this is the first study in an ongoing series of related work to see how the shutdowns impacted students' academic achievement and their growth. So to help break down this data even further, I spoke with one of the researchers from NWEA, Megan Caffeld. Megan, thanks for coming on NBCLX. You were one of the authors of this brief about education and learning during the pandemic. It's about 10 pages long. So tell us what exactly were the key findings here.
Yeah, so we looked at the academic achievement of students in grades 3 to 8 and found that students since the pandemic began appear to be doing pretty similarly in reading as they were doing before the pandemic, but have shown some slide in math. So students are about 5 to 10 percentile points lower in math than they were last fall. So we're referring to that as unfinished learning, some evidence of needing additional instruction and remediation in math.
And what do you think it is about math that people and students struggle with? Because I will admit I was that student, and from time to time today, I still struggle with math. It was my least favorite subject. But what do you think it is about math? Why are we seeing a decline in that?
So our assumption is that math may be harder in some ways to teach remotely, as well as it's harder for parents to kind of step in and fill in the gaps. Many parents feel comfortable, reading to their kids, making sure their kids have age-appropriate books. Parents are less likely to step in and do math in the home or kind of bring math into day-to-day activities to fill in some of the gaps that may have happened this spring with less instruction being provided remotely.
Okay, that makes sense. Did you notice any differences when it comes to like racial and ethnic groups in this study?
So what we found in math was that the gaps seemed to be, the slides seemed to be pretty much across the board. So all student groups seemed to be showing declines in math. Whereas in reading, we saw some evidence that Black and Hispanic students, particularly in elementary school, were more likely to be showing a little bit of a slide relative to white and Asian students. But the big caveat to our findings is that we were actually missing a lot of students this fall. There were a lot of students we were not able to get a hold of. And those students were disproportionately lower achieving and more likely to be in minority or in high poverty schools. So it's possible there's some gaps that are widening that we just weren't able to capture with this data due to the students having more challenges testing remotely or kind of other, just fully disengaging from school. And in addition, that make all of our evidence, all of our preliminary evidence on achievement gaps a little bit, cautious. We have to be really cautious interpreting them.
Got it. So what exactly happens now with all of this data? What do you do with it?
So we're hoping to continue tracking students throughout the school year and really understand places where, remote learning is working, is not working, which students seem to be really doing well, so that we can understand kind of, best practices moving forward. And, not that we hope to stay in this remote learning situation for a long time, but really trying to figure out what's working well and give that evidence back to teachers and schools.
Okay, and surely, like you just mentioned, we hopefully don't expect to do this remote learning for a very long time. What additional sources and support should be given to help these students get back in track once they are back in the classrooms and in-person learning? Because surely the impacts of this pandemic will linger. I mean, things won't be completely the same when students do get back into the classroom. So what other types of support, whether local, state, or federal government, do we need to do to help our students?
Well, we know that, both remote learning and getting students back in school safely is going to cost money. So I think one of the first big things that we really need is a bigger investment from the federal government in our education system, especially as school districts are facing budget cuts due to state and local funding sources running dry. I would say second, there's really promising evidence about tutoring programs and scaling up a national tutoring program to support students at different levels will be really essential to help kids catch up, because we can't just ask teachers to catch up for months of, missed instruction from the spring. We can't just, build that into a normal school day and say, okay, now catch up all these students. So I think both tutoring programs, but also thinking about summer school and kind of vacation academies, bringing in extra school time beyond the normal school day will be really important.
And with all this research, Megan, I'm curious, is there any advice you can give to parents who are still working from home or, doing the remote learning thing with their kids? And I know a lot of parents have been struggling with that throughout these past few months during the pandemic. With your research and what you found out with the survey and the report, anything you'd like to tell parents as they continue this into the foreseeable future?
I would say that, we know that this is a really tough time for students and for parents and for teachers. I mean, it is for everyone. And the good news from our report is that we see a lot of resilient kids. We see a lot of kids who are doing very either similarly or just a little bit lower than they were doing in the previous school year. So I think that the good news for this is that, many kids are weathering this. Teachers have really worked so hard this year to provide instruction remotely. And I would say, I think continuing to try to bring math, this is not a doom and gloom. They're off track forever. I think with a little bit of additional support, most students will be able to get back on track.
Yeah, absolutely. Got to give a shout out to all of the teachers, our educators, and the parents who are being educators this time around during the pandemic. Megan, thank you so much for joining us here on NBCLX.
Thank you so much.
And thank you, Jo Beth. Now, there's something else that we're all waiting on, and that's pandemic assistance from the feds. We're 1 week and 3 days away from the end of the CARES Act, and Congress is still gridlocked. NBCLX storyteller Clark Foraker, he's been keeping tabs on what's happening in D.C. Hey, Clark, what's the latest?
Yeah, hey, Tabitha, still no agreement. That's the headline. The lawmakers, the core four who are really negotiating this whole thing, they were up late overnight trying to haggle out the details of hundreds of billions of dollars. They do want to try to get this passed before Congress adjourns for the year. Here's what we know about the negotiations that happened last night. According to the New York Times, the talks between the two top Republicans and two top Democrats in the House and Senate, they went on until about 10 p.m. No public discussion yet of those details, but they were the first in-person talks in months for the leaders about this issue. That's House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, and then Representative Kevin McCarthy. They met in person. Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin was with them over the phone. They've all agreed that any additional pandemic aid should be wrapped up into the end of the year spending bill that Congress does have to vote on. McConnell said he's optimistic that this group will reach an agreement and said he plans for Congress to stay in session until the agreement is reached.
Hope is on the way, and our job here is to guarantee that there's enough money to facilitate the delivery, as well as to do other things that we can agree on. And as I've said repeatedly, number one, we're not leaving here without a COVID package. It's not going to happen. We're going to stay here until we get a COVID package. No matter how long it takes, we'll be here until we get a COVID package.
So one important note and a bit of a red flag, if you're taking advantage of any of the CARES Act unemployment aids, even if Congress passes a bill this week, it still might not be in time for millions of Americans to go for some period without income assistance. Here's the deal. Because state employment offices, they have already programmed their automated systems to cut off benefits when the current CARES Act pandemic aid ends on December 26th.